So hello, this is Beth Billings from Around the Table Yarns, and hello. And we are talking about gauge today, and we've had a little technical difficulties here, but I just want to all set. We're going to talk a little bit about evaluating gauge, and it was an interesting preparation for this class because I went to my favorite book, which is The Principles of Knitting by June Hemmons Hyatt, which is upside down and backwards here. But this is a huge text. And it's been out, it was out of print. The first edition was out of print for a long time. And then it came back into print like 2012. And I had a library copy of it that my husband got me for Christmas that cost him over $100. And before I I used to take it out of the library here, and it was like you'd be able to take it out for 3 weeks at a time, and I would just renew it. I would just keep it at my house and renew it every 3 weeks. So this has been a real Bible of knitting techniques, but she's rewritten in the new edition in a way that I'm not sure now if I feel as comfortable with it as I had before. So I'm not saying that this isn't a thoroughly comprehensive text, but it may be too thoroughly comprehensive because when I went to look at the gauge chapter to sort of take notes and get information about gauge, it kept referring me back to earlier techniques and earlier chapters. And like the third time it did that, the earlier chapter referred me back to an even earlier entry in the book. So I was looking in two different places for the information I needed to figure out gauge. And I kind of felt like this is needlessly complicated. And if you are trying to do something in knitting or crochet, because gauge really applies to both, my first feeling about it is that it shouldn't be needlessly complicated. I mean, yes, there's math involved. Liz is going to watch this video at some point and she's going to say, well, there's Beth making math happen again. And yes, there's definitely math involved with gauge and you need to be able to work it out. But at the same time, you don't want to have to go look it up in 3 different places in a 300-page book. So the first thing I want to say is whenever I teach something, I know that there are other ways to learn this. I know that there are other ways that teachers will teach you to do gauge. And so I am not going to sit here and claim that mine is the finest, best, least problematic way to do any skill, whether it's gauge or anything else. But I will promise you that it is the least complicated way to do it, because I feel strongly that complicating something needlessly makes it impossible to do. Because then you're always like the Kitchener stitch, it needs to get to a point where it's memorizable, or you might as well just do a 3-needle bind off. So that's where I'm coming from. So I want you to know that I'm looking for gauge to be something that's easy to remember, that uses your basic equipment that you would have for your project anyway, not something extra, and is reasonably quick compared to what your project is going to, take in terms of time. And then my last thing is, I think we're very frugal these days, and a lot of gauge descriptions talk about making a gauge swatch and keeping it forever. And I feel like the gauge swatch should be reusable if you need it. Like, you shouldn't make such a big thing that if you ran out of yarn and you needed those few yards, that you couldn't reuse it if you wanted to. So I'm not a big fan of gauge like in the round where you cut the strands. I'm not a big fan of having gauge stitch swatches just laying around my house. So those are just the things I want you to know, is that I want you to be able to remember this. I want you to have the equipment already. You don't need your blocking mat and pins and whatever. But I also want you to be able to reuse your yarn, and that you are able to do it in a relatively speedy way. So the only caveat to that is I'm going to have to agree. Did it just go off?
Oh, yeah.
The camera just went off. Screen mirroring. There's that. I'm going to put it on don't turn off.
So many things to remember. Oh.
So that's notification sounds. Is that right? Okay. All right, now never back to the camera, back to the table. Okay. And then it falls over. Whoop. Why are we off again? There we go. Okay, I hit a button. Okay, so the first and foremost thing that you need to know is that gauge equals the number of stitches, or a number of units per a number of other units. So a gauge is a measurement, like inches are a measurement, like centimeters are a measurement. And in this case, it's the number of stitches or rows per inches or measurements, or centimeters. Number of stitches or rows per inches or centimeters. So if we were anywhere but the United States, we would only be talking about centimeters. But we're here in the United States, so we're still going to talk about inches. The number of stitches per inch, or the number of rows per inch, are what we're talking about. And the way to measure gauge, I have a gauge swatch right here. The way to measure it is first to understand that when you do a swatch this size, so this swatch is roughly 5 by 5 inches, 4.5 by 5 inches. When you do a swatch like this, you're getting the gauge for this swatch. This is not the gauge for my full size sweater or blanket or hat or sock or whatever. This is the gauge for my swatch. So I am estimating my finished object gauge in a swatch. So the scientist in me remembers back to my statistics class when I was taught that if you want to find the average age of a population, you need more than three people, right? If you get the average age of a population from just like 3 or 4 or 10 or 11 people, it kind of depends where you got those people, but the average age of the population might be 7. But if you got 10,000 people, the average age of the population is more likely, potentially, to reflect the average age of the whole population of people. And it's just a long way of saying the more stitches you have to measure, the more accurate your gauge is going to be. So at the end of the day, your true gauge is going to be the actual measurement of your project. So if you're supposed to be getting 20 inches across, if it's supposed to be 20 inches from armhole to armhole, then when you get to the armhole to armhole part of the sweater and you measure it, it should be 20 inches wide. That number of stitches and that place should be 20 inches. So gauge is really, anything we do with a swatch is really just an estimate. But the way that we calculate it is to measure as closely to the lines inside of your ruler, as closely as you can, the number of inches across, and then divide the number of stitches by that measurement. So here, I came away without a pencil or a knitting needle. Because I'm a silly girl. So here I have one stitch right there. So this, my swatch is actually upside down. So I'm going to turn it back over. And here's my inches. And I'm going to measure across this row, and the stitches are V's. So 1 stitch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I have 16 stitches. I have 16 stitches, and my actual measurement from the 0 here to the end of my stockinette is 3 1/2, 5, 6, 7, 3 5/8. So the closest to the eighths measurement is 3 5/8. So I just need to remember, I'm going to clear that for a second, to find the decimal of 5/8, divide 5 by 8, it's 0.625. So 16 divided by 3.625. So my gauge is it's almost 4.5. And I could take that number of 4.41 and change, and I could write it down on my page, and then I'd know that my gauge on this needle for this swatch was 4.41. And if that's close enough to the gauge that the pattern wants, then I'm good. So if the desired gauge is 4.5 stitches to the inch, then I'm good. So that's one way to look at gauge. Another way to look at gauge is to just cast on the number of stitches that you want. So let's say 16 stitches here were supposed to be 4 inches. Well, it's not, it's 3 5/8. So if I'm trying to match a gauge, so the first way I just talked about, did my camera freeze? It keeps freezing. Okay, so the first way I talked about is how you can get the accurate gauge of your piece. So if you measure the number of stitches 16 by the actual measurement, it tells you that it's 4.41 stitches to an inch. If I'm trying to figure out if I've got 16 stitches to 4 inches, which is the desired gauge, I can tell you that I'm not, because just measuring across these 16 stockinette stitches, I'm not quite to 4 inches. It's at 3 5/8. So I would have to go up a needle size. So I'm on a 7. I made a mark on my gauge swatch so I know which one, and I would have to go up a needle size to be able to check the next one. And the next one might get me gauge, it might not. And if it doesn't get it quite, then I might have to go up another needle size. So those are 2 ways of measuring or calculating gauge. The first is measuring the actual gauge. So my actual gauge here is 4.41 stitches to the inch, but my desired gauge, the pattern gauge, was supposed to be 4 stitches to the inch. So I'd have to change my needle to a bigger needle to make these stitches slightly bigger to expand them out to 4 inches. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So the way that I got to this needle, or the way that you might approach a gauge swatch, you could do what's called a test swatch. And this was my test swatch, and it was very frustrating. I was using the Lily Sugar and Cream yarn from the department store, you know, from the Target. So it's the Sugar and Cream, the original Sugar and Cream. It's supposed to be 5 stitches to the inch. And I used a 7, an 8, and a 9 for this swatch, and it was supposed to be 5 stitches to the inch on the 7. And so that means that these, I cast on 10 stitches. So that means this should have been 2 inches wide. So this is 2 1/4. And then this was 2 1/2. And then this, for some reason, the largest size needle kind of went back to 2 and the same. So that would be very frustrating. And so one of the recommendations was do a test strip to get to the, to figure out what needle you're supposed to use. But I would have been pretty frustrated with doing that because 2 of the needles came out with the same gauge. Interestingly, this is a little bit more tightly knitted, and this is a little bit more loosely knitted because it's another needle size up. But if I were trying to pick which one was going to get me the right gauge, it wouldn't be any of these. I'd have to go down to a 6. But I just wanted to show you, because that I thought was very frustrating. And I can imagine when you're trying to figure out the gauge for a project, that can be a very frustrating experience to like try a swatch and then 2 needles have the same gauge. So having said that, I want to talk about what makes a good gauge swatch and how you should do it. And then you have to be willing to experiment with your needle sizes to get the gauge that you want. So this is an example of a good gauge swatch. I cast on in the middle the 16 stitches that I wanted, but I added 2 stitches on each end so I could do a garter stitch edge, which means I knitted across the face of the right side of the fabric, but on the wrong side, I knit 2, purled 16, and knit 2. And I knitted a couple of rows at the beginning and at the end so that I would not have, so I would have a frame. So I would have a frame of stitches around. Whoop. So you can see that I have a garter stitch frame around my whole swatch. Okay. Having a set number of stitches like 16 or 20 to me makes it very easy to do the math that we just talked about. Like if I had remembered that it was 16 and hadn't had to count, then I would just say, okay, so 16 stitches, divided by this actual measurement or this many rows. So I can count my rows on the back, and there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 22 rows, 22 rows. And I'm going to measure them inside of the garter stitch frame. And that's 3 and, it looks like 3 and 1, 2, 3, 5/16. 3 and 5/16 is the closest measurement. So I can do the math again. So 5 divided by 1/6 plus 3. So 3.3125. So 22 rows divided by 3.3125 rows per inch. Is 6 and, oh, it did it again.
You're froze.
Okay. Stop sharing. Let's just do it in front of me. At least I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so if I do that math, if I measure from just the stitches, it was 3 and 5/16. So if I do the math of 22 rows divided by 3 and 5/16, that's 6.64 rows to the inch. So from there, I can tell you how many rows it will be if I want to make it 20 inches long, right? Because I would just divide 20 by 6.64. And then I'd say I'd need this many rows. So the actual measurement of a gauge swatch is the most accurate thing that you can have. The approximation of the gauge that's required in the pattern depends on making a good gauge swatch and then changing the needle size until you get the closest approximation to what the pattern calls for. So The first thing is unrestricted edges. Garter stitch does not pull in on the sides of the stockinette stitch, so that's awesome. The cast on, which is down here, I don't know if you can see how loose it is, but it's a super loose cast on. I used both needles. So I cast on using both needles. So I already had those with me, right? Because I just used both of, it was a circular needle. I just put both ends of the needle in to make the cast on. The cast off, you can't really cast off around both ends of the needle. You either need to have a big fat needle in there or just be super sloppy loose. Now, my recommendation would be super sloppy loose, because you don't want this edge to restrict in on your stitches. You want your stitches to be as exactly what they are when you make them. If you have a tight cast on and you leave the stitches on the needle itself, that will condense and bind in the stitches. So you really want it to be off of the needles or at least on the cable. So to be a little quick and dirty, to find gauge, let's say you want 4 stitches to the inch or 5 stitches to the inch, like I did here. You want to cast on 10 stitches with your best guess of needle. Start with the needle the pattern calls for, start with the needle that the yarn calls for to get that gauge, or your best guess. Do at least a couple of inches. Move it to the cable or off the needles to measure across the center. If it is definitely not 2 inches, go up or down a needle size, but don't rip it out. Keep going, just reverse the direction of the knitting. So if this is my stockinette side here, when I changed needles, I moved up and I reversed the stockinette side to the back.
Okay.
So I just knit on the purl row and purled on the knit row. And then I did it again. And then I was like, okay, that's whatever. And then I did it again. And I've done this like starting with a size 5 needle and going up to a 9 to get the right gauge for something. So just do it until you don't need to do it anymore. And then really ideally block that fabric. So does that mean you have to like, and no, put it under the water in your hand and squeeze out excess so it's super saturated. Get a towel and press out as much extra water as you can, and then just let it dry flat somewhere. If it's a little crinkly, smooth it, pat it. Don't stretch it, don't pull it, don't do anything. So you want to bind, cast on loosely, bind off loosely. This one doesn't actually have any edges, but it was just my let's get to know this yarn, let's try these different needles. So then if you're doing a gauge swatch, a real gauge swatch, you want to cast on what would be at least 4 inches in the middle with 2 extra stitches on either side. Cast on super loose on a like two of the needle that you're going to use, or a much bigger needle than what you're going to use. And you're going to work a couple of rows in garter. So just knit a couple of rows. And then on the next knit, or in the next purl row, you're going to knit to purl 14 or purl 20 or purl whatever the 4 inches is supposed to be, knit 2. And you're going to work that for whatever number of rows you need to also have 4 inches. And then if you want to mark out what size the needle is, that's a knit 2 together yarn over for every number of the needle. So I did 7 for every number of the needle. And then I did 2 more rows and I bound off super, super sloppy loose. Okay, that gives you a nice place to do your measuring on the inside of. So it's pretty clear where the edge of the stitches is. I read in 2 places that the edge stitches can be a little bit stretched out compared to the center stitches. So they don't like measuring across an unfinished edge. Depends on your project. I feel like some things you really need the gauge to work. You really need the sizing to work. Some things like a blanket, you could probably get away without doing the edging. And a lot of places that I read said that the gauge swatch should be 6 to 8 inches wide and long. That just seems like a lot of work. I mean, there are a lot of projects that aren't 8 inches wide and long. So I just feel like 4 inches is a reasonable amount to ask somebody. Like if you're coming into the shop and asking me what should I do, I mean, like ideally I should tell you you should do an 8-inch gauge swatch, but you're gonna throw it in my face. Bernie especially will say, no, Beth, that's not gonna happen. So the other thing you should know about doing your gauge swatch that's really important is that you don't want to use different tools, yarn, person, color, anything than what you're going to actually make the project in. And that is because in some instances, the dye affects the gauge. I didn't believe this, but white particularly versus other colors. But some dyes, I think like some dark dyes can thicken up the yarn. Just know that. So you really should check it in the yarn you want to use. It should be pretty close in another color, but I can't make that guarantee because I've actually seen it affect it. You should try it in the stitch pattern that you want to do. Although many times in a pattern, in a designer's pattern, they'll say gauge in stockinette stitch. And you've got to figure that they work that out. So if they don't want you to do the gauge swatch in the pattern stitch, fine, but it could change. Like there could, like, especially if you're substituting yarn, there could be squirrels, as I, there could be something. You want to use the same yarn, obviously. So really the same yarn and the same color with the same stitch, the same tools. Don't use your straight needles for your gauge swatch if you can help it. Don't use your 16-inch bamboo instead of your 32-inch, Addy Turbo. Use the tool that you're going to do the main body of the project in. You should not try a new technique out on your gauge swatch. Like, oh, I want to learn how to hold my yarn continental, or I want to learn how to throw. Don't do that on the gauge swatch. Don't switch it in the middle of our project either, because you're guaranteed to change your gauge. So if you want to change your technique, do it in a practice sample. And you don't want to ask somebody else to do your gauge. I mean, that's sort of a no-brainer, but don't expect that somebody else's tension, because nobody's gauge is the same. Nobody holds their yarns the same. I've never seen two people who hold their yarns exactly the same. And I've seen some knitters who hold their yarns like nobody else. If you ever get to see Beth Lucci knit, she does this thing with her yarn and she's so fast. Like we should all copy her because she's like, okay. So the best characteristics of a gauge swatch so far: unrestricted edges, large enough, but not so big that you want to, use it for a blankie. The same hands, the same technique, the same tools, the same needles or crochet hook, the same yarn, the same stitch pattern, the same color. What if you're trying a new pattern out, like a new stitch pattern or a new technique for color work? Should you try that out in the gauge swatch? No. Practice it. Ooh. Practice it somewhere else first. Make sure if you're going to do something new, practice it so that your gauge is reasonably reflecting your actual work. If you're going to get better at that stitch just in practicing a gauge swatch, you're going to get even better when you get to the final product. So you should really be comfortable enough with the stitch when you're doing your gauge swatch. And that may be why some designers use stockinette. But so I highly recommend at least practice your new techniques before you gauge your yarn. And then I think it's really helpful if you do note the needle number in your swatch. I rarely do it. This is like, oh, look, I did it for you. This is me showing you what you should do. Don't do what I do, which is like something like this. But you should really note your needle size down. You know, if you're making notes on the back of your project or at the top of your project about your gauge, you can say what needles you're using and what size they were.
Beth, do you
Yeah.
ever find that once you started a project and you're like halfway through it, your gauge changes?
Yes.
So what do you do then?
It depends on how much.
Okay.
But it would be the same, and it could be as simple as I borrowed the needles for something else. I came back, didn't remember what needles I was supposed to be using, and used a different size than I should have. That's happened.
Now, see, I find that when I'm knitting, especially on a sweater, I'll start out, but by the time I get farther down, my knit gauge is smaller because I'm knitting tighter.
All right, tell me what you need.
I think that's a very difficult problem because if you're knitting tighter and tighter as you go through, then you're potentially
Changing your size.
Yeah, I kind of feel like maybe only do so much time on one project.
Okay.
And then take a break. Because I feel like that's a personal tension. It's not a product of your needles or your yarn. It's a product of your fatigue and your drive to get to the end of the project. And so if it's actually affecting your gauge as you approach the end of the project, then you should relax.
Put it down and have one project.
Put it down and have a nice cup of tea.
Beth, when I do a gauge swatch, a lot of times my stitch width is good, but the rows are not.
Yeah, I
on.
have the same
What-
problem.
So
How-
I
How
was
big of an issue is that then? I know.
it is an issue for diagonal shaping of raglans.
Right. Yeah.
It is an issue for like the top of a sleeve, for a set-in sleeve if you're rounding the top of the sleeve. It is an issue for
Sleeve length too.
it's
Like-
not as much an issue for length because
Well, if you're doing decreases though, every so many, I know I've had things that I would get far enough and then I had to rip back because I needed to do more decreases and I was already past where I needed to be.
so it's important to check your row gauge.
Yeah.
It's important to know I am getting a lot fewer rows per inch or a lot more rows per inch than the pattern calls for. Therefore, if the pattern says every 6 rows and the pattern's getting 6 rows per inch, but I'm getting 4 rows per inch, then I should do my decreases every 4 rows. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Right. Yeah. I mean, but
So
Oh,
what I would do is look at the pattern row gauge. If they give it, sometimes they don't, but
Yeah.
if the pattern has a row gauge, I would look at that, I would compare mine, and then I would convert, because it would be just like if you were doing the whole pattern in a different stitch gauge.
sure.
Convert all of the horizontal measurements to your gauge. So you would just convert all of the vertical measurements to their gauge, to your gauge, and then, so instead of doing every 6th row, you do every 4th. Or, you know, God forbid it's every 5th and you have to do it on alternating rows. But
Yeah.
then in that case, you could do every 4th, every 6th, every 4th, every.
Right. Right.
But there's a way around that if you have to. But you have to know what your row gauge is. The other thing is that some yarns are going to be more affected by wear and material and the weight of the project. So
Yeah.
Lily's Sugar and Cream is an extremely heavy yarn. And if you make a whole sweater out of it, over time, it's going to do this. It's just going to stretch and stretch, and it's going to get longer and longer. And so there are ways of weighting your gauge swatch so that you can estimate for that. but it means that in the first couple of wears of the project, it might be short. I try to minimize that by my choice of materials. Really, I try not to knit with pure cottons and something that's going
Right. Yeah.
So that takes into consideration before blocking or before dressing your swatch and after. So a good idea is to measure your swatch before and after you block it. So I measured this and I got the same measurements, and I was like, I wonder if it'll grow on the top if I measure it, if I block it, and it didn't. It was really, I mean, I was just like, I don't understand. So this is smaller and these are both the same size. I measured this as well, and it was pretty, this yarn did not have a difference after blocking, but it would if I were making something that's going to hang on your body. Sure. If I'm making a blanket, it's probably not going to, it's called drop. So you might get extra drop. So you have to sort of take that into consideration. Also, like, gauge, just in my personal experience, you can get a gauge of like 3 stitches to the inch with a lace weight yarn if you cast on really big needles. But the question is, so
do you like the fabric that you're going to get with the gauge you're getting too?
And are you measuring it like pinned down? Because that fabric is very stretchy this way and very stretchy that way. So you need to pin it to your measurements to check that gauge so that the row gauge is for the same, so it's a fixed row to stitch ratio kind of thing. That gets a little more complicated. I think that it's easier to do things like that, to use a thinner yarn if it's single ply or mohair or alpaca, something with a little bit of a halo, because the halo will help hold the stitches open and hold it to the larger gauge. I think if you do that with something silky or slinky or cotton, you're just gonna, it's just netting.
Yeah.
So,
well, some of the real woolly wools, when you wash them, they bloom a lot too. So depending on how you want it to look, makes a big difference.
Well, and that's another point about doing a gauge swatch, is it's also a test of the whole thing.
Right.
It's a test of your needles. It's a test, like somebody came in the other day and she'd been knitting on this project with bad needles. I'm just going to say bad needles. And she had been working on it for a year and she just hated the project. And we're like, switch needles.
Yeah.
And she did. And now she's happy. And it's like, the tool makes a big difference. So have the right needles from the get-go. If you do a gauge swatch on the needles you think you're going to use and you hate them, you're not going to like them more.
No, the more you use them.
No.
I'll just get used to it. No. And if you hate the stitch, there's Joji Locatelli's, what is it? It's not Holiday. She's got a light one and a regular weight one. Hipster, the hipster shawl. You have to do these like crosses, these stitch crosses. I hate that. I don't want to do it. I started my, it's in my, you know what? That one can go.
Get that out. Yeah.
Yes, again. I'm so excited. Yeah. So it gives you a chance, and it gives you a chance to block the fabric. And this is my last thing that I'm going to say today. And that is, blocking your swatch is not a waste of time.
Yeah.
Not ever. This is exactly the same blocked as it was pre-blocked. The yarn that I spent a fortune on before I was, in the business of buying at wholesale, and then knitted a sweater for my tiny little sister-in-law, had silk in it, and it stretched 30% after I blocked it. And I had not blocked my swatch. and my sister-in-law got a duster instead of instead of a cardigan. And it was just a terrible object lesson, and you should always block it, because if I had known that it did what it did after washing, I would have done something else. I would have knitted it shorter. I would have, I honestly would have done something else, because it was
Or a whole different project. And
or a
not,
whole different, a whole, I mean, it was a shibui yarn that had silk in it. It was shibui, I can't think of it, but it's their silk and wool blend fingering yarn. And what cracked me up is, like, a year later, there was a book that came out that used that yarn. And in every pattern that used that yarn, there was a little preface that said, block before using, this yarn will stretch. And I'm like, couldn't you have printed that on the label?
That's true.
If you're going to the trouble of saying it in your own pattern book, couldn't you have put it on the label? That would have been helpful.
Sure.
But some yarns are really notorious for that, and silk and cotton and linen, some of the plant-based or non-woolen based or non-animal based yarns are, I mean, I guess silk is sort of animal based, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So
I have with linen like that. I make sure when I made half a sweater, and I didn't make a swatch because it was just a plain sweater and linen. And oh my God, as I was knitting it, it was stretching.
Yep. It's a lot. So remember that gauge is the size of the stitch. It's either the width or the height of the stitch. So stitches per inch or stitches per centimeter. It applies to crochet as much as it does to knitting. I probably should have said that right at the beginning. But it does apply to crochet as much as it does to knitting. You can check the gauge of your crochet in the same way that you check the gauge of your knitting. It's just doing things with the hook, changing the size of the hook instead of the size of the needle. One thing I have learned, though, is that how you crochet, how you finish each crochet stitch can change the height of the crochet stitch. Yeah. And is it the lift that you do at the end?
I'm not sure, but I know, because my friend crochets different than I do, and hers always comes out a lot smaller.
So it has to do, because when you're crocheting, you're bringing loops through other loops with the hook. Right. And there's a lift that, like, if you come out and your hook stays parallel.
Right.
If it comes out and it's a little bit elevated versus if it comes out and you like really lift it like perpendicular, that changes the height of the stitch, and it can make a double look like a treble, or a single or a double look like a single, just kind of depending on how much you do that. So that goes right down under technique. Like, if you're going to do a crochet gauge, you need to make sure you're using the same technique throughout, or your row gauge is going to change. And that's where I have the most issues in gauge, is in my crochet, because my stitch height is all over the place.
That's how mine is too. I never really thought it was that important to keep track of the row gauge. I always ignored it. Now I know not to.
I think it's only ignorable if it doesn't matter at all in the pattern. Like, if the pattern says knit to 40 inches, cast off.
Yeah.
Right. That's right.
Knit to 40 inches and cast off. But if the pattern says knit, decrease one row or one stitch every fourth row now, but crochet patterns are written a little bit differently. They're not as pardon me, they don't depend so much on, they're written out by row,
right?
More, I think, and less of this, like, for the next 25 rows,
yeah,
right,
decrease one stitch at the neck edge, blah 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 blah,
right.
So, okay, was that perfectly understandable?
Yeah,
sure.
Love all my audio-visual difficulty. I swear to God, this morning I was supposed to bring the other camera that I use at home for sock club, and I forgot. I brought everything else, but I forgot that.
Well,
That's okay. This is good.
yeah, I just really kind of wanted to get on and see how it worked. I had not come to a class before, so.
Well, we're delighted to see you for a class next week. I think belay crochet.
I'm not a crocheter, so.
You might
But-
want to be.
Yeah, I've got so many projects between that and my quilting that I've got to live to be about 200. So, but I only have,
So say
only
we
have
all.
I only have 5 works in progress right now,
Did you
knitting.
sign up?
So
Did you sign up for the finish something challenge?
no. So, but
You could win prizes. Just saying. All right. Well,
I'm also working on a quilt, so I'm